Well, hello. Good morning, everyone. I am Vino. I work as a developer advocate at Snowflake, and today is a big day. I'm not sure if you've heard, our Polaris catalog is open source and it's available on GitHub today. So, to talk all things Polaris, I have with me Michael, who's a senior software engineer at the Polaris catalog team. Hey, Michael, excited to have you on the show today.
Hey, Vino. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Mm-hmm. Super stoked. And this has been a very busy morning. I'm assuming, how's it been for you?
Yes, extremely busy. But we're really excited to have everything out. We're really excited to, have everything ready for people to review. So yeah, it's a great day for us.
Mm-hmm. And for everyone who's joining here today, this is the big news that I was talking about. Polaris Catalog finally out there. Go check it out. And oh my God, that looks so cool. We have the docs, and I guess we're going to have a quick live demo as well. It's later part of the live session. And yes, very exciting. Lot more to talk about Polaris. So I'm gonna dive right in. So Michael, I know there's been honestly from the summit, one of the biggest talking points was that announcement of Polaris catalog, and there's been a lot of excitement from the community about what is Polaris and what should we know about it.
Yeah. So maybe we can kind of step back for a minute and just talk about what Iceberg catalogs are. So Iceberg is an open table format, right? And it's a way for different engines to communicate about the structure of a table and about the content of a table, and it really allows for better interoperability between different engines. And Snowflake, of course, has Iceberg support internally, and we expose Iceberg tables for customers. But what we really need is a centralized way of managing the metadata about Iceberg catalogs. So I think you have a graphic that shows the kind of a structure of Iceberg metadata.
Uh-huh. Yep, I have it right here. This specific one you're talking about?
Yeah, there we go. All
Uh,
right. So here we have an Iceberg catalog, and so Iceberg tables are structured as metadata, right? So we have a metadata JSON file that tells you where a list of manifests files are, and those manifest files tell you where all of the data for your table is. So the main purpose of a catalog then is to really maintain the current pointer to the metadata for a table. And most critically, right, we need to be able to swap out the current metadata for a table. So when you make an update, we need to be able to communicate that to everybody and say, hey, that metadata now lives at this location. So all of the queries going forward should point to the latest version of the metadata.
mm-hmm.
And then there are some convenience features in there as well, right? So like catalogs also allow you to list tables and list namespaces. Now there are a bunch of catalogs that already exist in the Iceberg SDK. So for example, Snowflake has an Iceberg catalog that allow you to list all of the Iceberg tables that you have in Snowflake, but there's also ones for other vendors and other storage utilities, right, like DynamoDB and AWS Glue and stuff like that. Now, as it is right now, the catalog code generally has to live inside of your Iceberg application, which provides like all kinds of headaches and stumbling blocks. So the Iceberg project has introduced a specification for a REST catalog that is an endpoint that lives outside of your application where you can manage all of the metadata separately. So Polaris is an implementation of that REST catalog.
Gotcha. Okay, because I was going to ask you this question next. You kind of preemptively answered it, which is for someone who does not use any of these table formats today, the minute we talk about Polaris, we naturally tie into Iceberg catalog. And I'm like, how do they even tie in? Like, why do we talk about Polaris and Iceberg in the same sentence? So for those who don't use any table formats today, Iceberg is one of the open table formats, and it has this REST, catalog. REST catalog API spec, which Polaris uses to build a catalog implementation around it. Did I summarize that right?
That's right. Yeah, it's an implementation of the REST catalog, and so Iceberg clients that are already out in open source today immediately know how to talk to Polaris because Polaris speaks the same language. It talks over this REST protocol that's defined in that client specification.
Gotcha. Is that the central piece of giving us interoperability between the different query engines to read and write the same data?
That's right. Yeah. So because Snowflake knows how to speak Iceberg REST, and because Spark knows how to speak Iceberg REST, and Trino knows how to speak Iceberg REST, all three of those engines can talk to the same, can manipulate the same tables and work with the same data, and there's full interoperability between them.
Gotcha. So for folks who are new to this Iceberg and the data format world, like the table format world, if you have data that is external to Snowflake, and if you want to work with Snowflake to query that data or read and write that data, Iceberg and Polaris together can make that happen for you. So, that's probably a good mental model for you to understand where exactly is this, falling into the entire data platform that Snowflake offers. All right, now also kind of getting in there, if I am a data practitioner today, work with Snowflake, where does it tie in? How do I think about Polaris Catalog in my day-to-day life? Like, where would I be actually using it?
Yeah, so Polaris is really there to help increase the interoperability between your Snowflake environment and external Iceberg data. All right. So, for example, if you are importing a bunch of data from externally, you can query that data from Snowflake by connecting it to your Polaris catalog. And vice versa, if you have a bunch of data, Iceberg data that's in Snowflake, and you want to be able to read that data from, Spark or Beam or something like that, you can connect through Polaris and access all of your Snowflake data.
Gotcha. I think interoperability being the keyword of the entire conversation today.
That's right.
Awesome. And did we talk about, I know that Snowflake had Iceberg table support for a while now. It even went GA play. Now we have Polaris Catalog added on top of that. So what exactly is the delta that we're trying to solve with Polaris Catalog that we couldn't with Iceberg tables on their own? Where does
Well, yeah. So the primary, so one of the big differences is, so first off, right, Snowflake has its Iceberg table implementation, and we have our catalog implementation in the Iceberg SDK, which is really just a wrapper around JDBC driver. So you're executing SQL and querying Snowflake to find the list of your Iceberg tables. We do not have a REST API. All right. So you can't actually talk to Snowflake Iceberg tables using the REST endpoint. And so Polaris allows you to do that, to talk to Snowflake and query Snowflake Iceberg tables using the REST API. But a big new feature that Polaris introduces that's actually not in the Iceberg spec is access controls. So we provide a way for you to define which tables should be accessible, who should have read access to what, and who should have write access. And so there's a lot more governance features that are included with Polaris.
Gotcha. I think with Snowflake, security and governance are one of the biggest pillars we consider as the core tenets of what makes Snowflake Data Platform what it is. So I am excited to see how maybe using Polaris, we are able to implement those governance controls on Iceberg tables. Do you have a demo perhaps that you want to show us?
Yeah, sure. Here, let me share my screen.
All right. I see a lot of live questions already too. So it's going to be a fun session.
All right. Let me know when you can see my terminal.
Yep. We're able to see it.
Okay. So I just have the open source Polaris repository checked out, and in the repository, there's this kind of getting started notebook. And so I'm going to spin that up using Docker Compose. And you can see the very cool ASCII art that prints whenever the service starts up. And then here in a second, we'll see the notebook. There we go. All right, so now we have this notebook URL. I'm going to flip over to my browser, and we're going to reload. All right. Now, whenever we start up in test mode, we need some access credentials. And so this is just the in-memory store. So we just print some access credentials to the log.
Mm-hmm.
This only happens with the in-memory persistence layer. So, all right. So so the notebook basically is going to use the Python Polaris client to interact with the Polaris catalog, and also to use Spark to start querying some data. So what I'm doing right now is just using these root credentials that I generated. I'm going to create a token and then create a new instance of the Polaris Catalog API client. And then the first thing I need to do in Polaris is create a catalog. So we can see what the storage configuration is for my catalog. It's going to store some data in S3, and I'm calling it Polaris Demo. This Polaris Demo is an internal catalog, which basically just means that Polaris itself hosts all of the metadata for this catalog. It doesn't actually live somewhere else, right? Like a Snowflake Catalog or something like that. You can see what the response from the API is. And then I have a handful of utility functions. And so there are a couple of concepts to be familiar with when it comes to Polaris's privilege model, and those are principals, principal roles, and catalog roles. So principal, I think most people are very familiar with. A principal generally represents either a person or an application. So that principal will be used to connect with its credentials. So if I have a Spark application that's doing analysis for my clickstream data or something like that, that Spark application is going to be represented as a principal in the system. Now, principals have principal roles, right? So I have a role of engineer, but I also have other roles. So for example, I'm a member of the data lake team, the catalog team. I'm also a member of the Snowflake product team, right? And with each of these roles, I may have different privileges. And so then within a catalog, we have catalog roles, and those catalog roles really represent what your capabilities are within this catalog. So you might have a catalog role such as catalog admin, right, where you might be the administrator for a given catalog, where in other catalog roles, maybe you have read-only access or you have read-write access. So I'm going to create my utility functions here. And now I'm going to go ahead and create some new a new principal, and I'm going to call it Collado, and I'm going to assign this principal the principal role of engineer. Now, within the Polaris demo catalog, the engineer principal role is going to have this managed catalog role. And we've defined this managed catalog role down here as basically just having catalog managed content privileges. And catalog managed content is just an easy way of saying that I can read, write, and list everything that's in the catalog.
Gotcha.
But now let's say if I have a friend, a coworker named Martin, who is a product manager, and the product managers often want to be able to access the data as well. But we don't always trust the product managers because they like to break stuff on the engineers, right? So we're going to give my friend Martin here a principal and a principal role of product manager. But within my catalog, we're going to give him a new catalog role that is read-only. And here we kind of enumerate the list of privileges that we're giving Martin. That is table list, read properties, read data, as well as access to views and namespaces. But you'll notice there are no create and no write and no drop privileges. So I'm going to connect using Spark to the Polaris catalog. And while it's downloading all of its dependencies and everything, I'll just kind of skip through some of this setup. Most of this is boilerplate Iceberg setup, right? So downloading jars. But then we're going to define the Polaris catalog, and we're going to tell Iceberg that it is a REST catalog. And we're going to tell it where it lives, which is here on my local host. We're going to give it the credentials, which are here my engineer principal credentials. And we're going to specify the Polaris demo catalog that I created earlier.
Gotcha.
And we're going to set the scope, which I'll come back to in a minute. But right now, we're going to just say the principal role is all. And then we're going to tell Iceberg to use access delegation, and then set a couple of other, like I said, generic Iceberg settings. So now if I execute show namespaces. So I want to use the Polaris catalog, and then I'm going to call show namespaces. And there are no namespaces here. And so I'm going to go ahead and create some.
Our namespace is a set of new Snowflake objects to actually list the catalogs that we have in here.
So namespaces are an Iceberg concept, and it's basically just a way of kind of like, think of them like subdirectories. So in Snowflake, we usually use database and schema as a way to organize our tables. So in Polaris, our database and schema in Snowflake is represented as namespaces.
Got it. Okay. That's helpful.
All right. So we can now see the namespace that I just created in Collado test. And we're going to use that namespace, and then we're going to create a brand new table. And if I queried from that table, we're going to see that it is empty. Right? So we're going to just insert some records.
Interesting. So we've created an Iceberg table, and we're inserting some data into that Iceberg table in Snowflake.
No, just in Spark. So this data lives only in Polaris right now.
Got it. Okay.
Now, if I were doing this in a production instance of Polaris, what I would then do is I would go over to my Snowflake account, and I would create a catalog integration and connect my Snowflake account to my Polaris catalog, at which point I would be able to add any of the tables that I created inside of Polaris, and Snowflake would be able to query those tables directly.
Got it. Okay. So from the Iceberg table world, when I'm creating an Iceberg table, when I use the Snowflake catalog integration, I would be using a Polaris catalog integration to, actually read this data.
That's right. That's right.
All right.
All right. So now what I want to do is use, again, the Iceberg client API, the Python client. And I'm going to generate a token for myself using my engineer principles, my engineer principal client credentials. And I'm going to directly call the load table API. And this load table API is what Spark and Trino and other Iceberg clients use in order to get the latest version of the metadata. So you can kind of see what Polaris is managing. So you can see the location of the table, you can see the schema, you can see the snapshot that I just created, so the data that I just wrote. But then if we skip all the way down to the end here, we can also see the access credentials. So Polaris manages storage access credentials for you. So rather than a person having to send out the AWS keys to all of the people that need access to the data, those clients can get those access credentials straight from Polaris, and we scope them down so that way they're limited only to the table that you need access to at the moment. And these are short-lived credentials, so they'll expire within a few minutes here. But if I were to copy and paste these credentials into my terminal and try to list the data in S3, I'd be able to list things like the metadata directory for my new Iceberg table, but I wouldn't be able to list anything else inside of that bucket.
Gotcha. It's just the metadata that you get to read from.
The metadata and the data files, both. So now I want to go back to Spark and create a new session, but this time I'm going to use the reader principals credentials. So my friend Martin's principal credentials. And we're going to use Polaris again, and we're going to call show tables. And we can see that Martin can see the tables, the table that I just created. And if he tries to select, there's all the data that I inserted a minute ago. But now if I try to insert, that insert fails. And if we kind of look at the error message, we're going to see that this is actually an S3 exception, that is access denied. And that is S3 itself is enforcing the access control because of those vended credentials that I sent out, or that I showed earlier. So those credentials are giving Martin read access, but if he tries to write anything, S3 is going to say no way.
Very cool.
And we'll skip down to the end here. All right. So, and then similar to what I did above is I can use the Python client and call the load table API directly. And we're going to see a lot of the same metadata that we saw earlier, but we're going to see different access credentials here. And again, if I were to use these in my in my terminal, then I would be able to list and read files, but I would not be able to write anything. And then if Martin tries to like drop some tables on me, we're going to see again this forbidden exception. And this is actually enforced at the Polaris level, the catalog, before it even hits storage.
Mm-hmm. That's very cool.
So I mentioned earlier about scopes. So again, right, like I hold many different roles in my role as an engineer at Snowflake. And one of my roles is as an on-call engineer, I have to be able to debug and diagnose production issues. But I want to be very careful when I'm working with production because I don't want to accidentally drop some data, right, or delete things that I'm not supposed to delete. So what I can do is I can create a second role for myself called ops engineer. And this principal role is going to be assigned to the principal, or this role is going to be assigned to the principal engineer. But we're going to specify that the catalog role within this catalog is going to be read-only. So maybe in my my sandbox account, I might have read-write privileges, but in my production account, I'm only going to give myself read-only access. Now, this is in addition to my principal or my engineer principal role. So I haven't replaced my principal my principal role. I've added to it. And now, normally, when I connect with principal role all, I'll have the privileges of like kind of the union of all of my different principal roles. Mm-hmm. But here, I'm going to tell it, I want to scope myself down to just the ops engineer principal role. So we're going to use, again, the same kind of Spark session. And if I recall show tables, right, it's going to list the table that I just created. And if I try to read, we're going to see the data that I inserted earlier. But now, suddenly, if I try to insert, even though my engineer principal has read-write privileges inside of this catalog, mm-hmm. because I scoped myself down to ops engineer for this particular session, I only have read access. And then if I were to try to connect to our production data set and I accidentally ran drop tables, which
only accidentally, yes.
Right. Which I've done in production before. I think probably most people have, but I'm going to get this forbidden exception, right? So this is just a way for me to protect myself and protect my production data and make sure that I don't accidentally make a mistake.
Mm-hmm. This is definitely cool. Okay, so when we started out, this principal role had both read-write access. Only the PM role had read-only access. But then further down the line, we were able to scope out, even for the principal role, to have only catalog read permissions. And now we're only able to read the data. So we are able to work with whatever level of permissions that we want to and update it at the principal level.
That's right. Yeah, and it's just an easy way to make sure that your access controls are enforced in a given environment. So, if you're working inside of your test system, you want to have lots of privileges. But then when you start working inside of your production system, you really want to be able to explicitly state when you want read-write permissions.
Got it. That's very cool. Now that we talked about a lot of these, access permissions and governance, I know with Snowflake, we also have Horizon that also helps us with the governance side of things. So where do these two compare, and when should I use what? Or what's going on with these two?
Yeah, so Polaris is really focused on only Iceberg right now. So, if you are trying to figure out how can you manage permissions and privileges for your Iceberg tables, and you have a bunch of external engines that are operating on your data, Polaris is really a way to help you enforce that. So even if you're kind of exposing your Snowflake Iceberg tables through Polaris, we can enforce these privileges on your Snowflake Iceberg tables. So that way you can be sure that even if you are accessing them through Spark or something else, that your privileges are enforced.
Got it. Okay, so then is Horizon implemented on top of Polaris? Because Horizon has been around for a while. Polaris is a new thing. So I don't quite see how they're, in terms of implementation, how they work together.
Yeah, so Horizon is really going to be focused on your on Snowflake data. And again, Polaris is really focused on enforcing those privileges outside of the Snowflake ecosystem, right? So making sure that Spark, Trino, Beam, whatever else that you're using to actually access the Iceberg data, but also, right, like again, Polaris is open source, and it's really focused on interoperability. So we really want to be able to kind of establish a privilege model that lives even beyond your Snowflake data, right? So we need a way for you to be able to access or manage access controls for data regardless of where it lives.
Okay, I think that's helpful. And I feel like we are at the end of the demo and maybe a good time to get started with the live questions. I see there's a lot of live questions coming up. And before that, just a quick summary for folks who've been tuning in. I know this was probably a lot to take for some of us. One is that with Iceberg Table, we are able to work with the data that is outside of Snowflake and read from it, create Iceberg tables, and Snowflake was able to help you with all of that. Now, with Polaris Catalog and added on top of it, not only can you read, but you can also write back. But then Polaris Catalog is also this like one-stop shop for managing access controls for all of your data. Could be either in Snowflake, could be out of Snowflake. You still need a way of, managing these permissions and access controls from that one place, which is where I guess Polaris comes in to help. All right, time for live questions. Oh, okay. Anders has a question. Other providers have a limitation. If the data have been written with a Spark engine, a developer is unable to write to the same table with a SQL endpoint. What do Polaris do in these cases? That's very interesting.
Yeah. So if the data is managed in Polaris, then you can read and write to it through the REST API. Now, if I mentioned earlier that we have these internal catalogs, there are external catalogs in Polaris, and an external catalog is just a way of saying that the data is mastered somewhere else. So like this is kind of a replication endpoint. And in those cases, you only have read access within Polaris. So if your data is managed in another catalog and that's its primary, where it primarily lives, then you still kind of replicate that data in Polaris, but it is going to be read-only.
Gotcha. Okay. And what do we have? Wow. Okay. So somebody has already reviewed the open source code, which is super exciting. And they say currently there is no backend database support. And when do we expect that to be supported? I know it's in the works because it's a new baby coming out, but
yeah. So there is actually in the extensions directory there is an Eclipse Link implementation, which is an ORM implementation, which should work with JDBC databases like Postgres and whatnot.
Oh, so you say it's already there?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fantastic.
Should be there, unless I missed something in the import.
Well, unless somebody deleted something in the production, sure. Oh, okay. So I think this is maybe let's reiterate what Polaris Catalog does that Iceberg doesn't today.
So it's a little bit of a tricky question because Iceberg again is a table format, and it comes with a specification for a REST catalog, but it doesn't come with a REST catalog. So there is no open source implementation of the REST catalog within the Iceberg project. So this is what we would like to call a reference implementation of the specification that comes in the Iceberg project. But again, like Iceberg itself doesn't provide a reference implementation.
Yeah, I think to think about it more like Iceberg is a table format. It defines what exactly goes into a table. But then Polaris is a catalog. But then Iceberg, although it's a table format, it gives us the spec. You can think of it more like a set of instructions, so to speak, of, hey, if you want to interact with an Iceberg table, maybe these are the ways you want to consider, like make it uniform across all the different catalogs. And then Polaris takes that specs and really implement it as a way of talking to those Iceberg tables.
That's right. That's right. And Iceberg itself, or as a project and as a community, is hoping to get out of the business of managing catalogs. Because right now, if you look in the Iceberg code base, there are a bunch of different catalog implementations, right? Like I kind of mentioned earlier, DynamoDB and Snowflake has one, and there's a JDBC one for your Postgres. There's a Hive catalog, and all of that code lives inside of the Iceberg project, but it's kind of a headache to maintain, right? Because again, when you spin up your applications, all of that catalog code has to live inside of your Iceberg application, and it's a lot of maintenance on the maintainers, and they have to make sure that there's a lot of compatibility concerns, that a lot of maintenance concerns. There's a lot of like feature reimplementation. So as a community, Iceberg is wanting to get out of managing the catalog. And so that's why there is a big push towards having the REST catalog implemented.
Okay. Yep. That's very helpful. I guess we just have maybe the last question and we could wrap up the session. Is there same level of support for Flink as Spark in Polaris? Because I know we always, show Spark in most of our demos, but does that mean we have similar level of support for Flink as well?
Yeah, so any Iceberg client that supports the REST catalog works with Polaris. So that does include Flink, that includes Trino, that includes basically all of the open source products that work with Iceberg REST catalogs.
Awesome. So yes, although you see a lot of Spark in the demos, we do support Flink as well, and that's fantastic to know. And with that said, we are at the end of the session. It was fantastic, Michael. Thanks for talking through, all about Iceberg and Polaris catalogs, and also showing a demo of how the added access permissions and governance control would come in handy for us. And also, like, big thanks to the audience for wonderful questions. These are very insightful for, I'm sure, other folks watching as well. And that's pretty much it. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining. Have a good day, good evening, and good night, wherever you're all tuning in from. Thank you. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks.